How temporary measures became permanent. It was supposed to be a short detour, a limited response to extraordinary conditions. Yet years later, the detour quietly became the road itself. To understand how temporary measures turn permanent, we need to look at how systems respond to relief. When pressure eases, urgency fades. Tools introduced to stabilize markets remain in place because removing them feels riskier than keeping them. Stability becomes the argument for continuation. Each extension feels reasonable. The system is still adjusting. Conditions are not fully normal. Withdrawal can wait. What began as patience slowly turns into habit. Temporary language remains, but behavior changes as if permanence is assumed. Institutions adapt quickly. Planning incorporates continued support. Strategies are optimized around its availability. Balance sheets are structured with the expectation that exceptional measures will still be there when needed. The temporary becomes operational. Markets reinforce the shift. Prices reflect ongoing accommodation. Risk premiums shrink. Volatility responds more to policy hints than economic fundamentals. The longer measures persist, the more markets treat them as structural rather than exceptional. Regulators face a narrowing set of choices. Removing support risks disruption. Maintaining it reinforces dependence. Each delay increases the cost of reversal. The system appears stable, but that stability increasingly relies on what was never meant to last. Early signs of permanence emerge quietly. Language softens. Deadlines move. Programs are renewed with minor adjustments. What was once described as extraordinary becomes described as prudent. The measure remains because its absence feels unfamiliar. This is how temporary actions outlive their purpose, not through decision, but through deferral, not through intent, but through comfort. The system adjusts around them until removing them feels like change, and keeping them feels like continuity. The question is no longer whether the measures worked. It is whether the system remembers how to function without them. As temporary measures stayed in place, they quietly rewired incentives across the system. What was once a cushion against instability became a reference point for decision-making. Planning no longer asked whether support would exist, but how long it would last. Institutions adjusted their behavior accordingly. Liquidity strategies assumed continued accommodation. Risk tolerance expanded within the comfort protection. Long-term decisions were shaped by short-term relief that kept getting renewed. The line between emergency planning and normal operations dissolved. Markets adapted even faster. Asset prices incorporated the expectation of ongoing support. Volatility compressed. Corrections softened. Participants learned that downturns were likely to be met with response before they deepened. Timing replaced fundamentals as a dominant consideration. This adaptation created a subtle dependency. Stability was no longer self-sustaining. It was maintained through anticipation of continuation. When conditions improved, support remained. When uncertainty appeared, extension felt necessary. The system learned that normalization was optional. Regulators felt the weight of these expectations. Every signal carried consequence. Even cautious language moved markets. Withdrawing measures risked destabilizing behavior shaped by their presence. Maintaining them risked entrenching reliance. Each choice constrained the next. Early distortions appeared quietly. Sensitivity to policy signals increased. Small changes in guidance produced outsized reactions. Confidence depended less on economic strength and more on reassurance. The system felt calm but reactive. This was the deeper transformation. Temporary measures did not just stabilize conditions. They reshaped how stability itself was defined. Normal became inseparable from support. Uncertainty became something to manage with extension rather than adjustment. The danger was not the measures themselves. It was the loss of a clear endpoint. Without one, temporary relief stopped being a bridge and became infrastructure. And once support becomes infrastructure, removing it feels less like recovery and more like risk. The conflict emerges when the system begins reacting more to the possibility of withdrawal than to underlying conditions. Markets grow anxious not about weakness, but about change. Stability feels secure until the idea of normalization appears. Institutions face growing tension. Strategies built around continued support become vulnerable to uncertainty about its future. Planning scenarios multiply, decisions slow. Risk is no longer tied to economic reality alone, but to policy timing and interpretation. Markets amplify the unease. Asset prices fluctuate sharply on hints of reduction. Volatility clusters around speeches and guidance rather than data. Participants reposition defensively, not because fundamentals deteriorate, but because support might. The system becomes sensitive to expectation shifts rather than structural change. Regulators encounter the limits of gradualism. Every attempt to signal withdrawal triggers reaction. Moving too quickly risks disorder. Moving too slowly deepens dependence. Communication becomes as critical as action, yet even perfect messaging cannot eliminate uncertainty. Public perception follows confusion. If temporary measures are still necessary, what does that say about the system's strength? If removing them causes instability, were they ever temporary at all? Trust begins to hinge on reassurance rather than understanding. This is the central conflict. Measures introduced to stabilize conditions now generate instability when questioned. The system has adapted so fully that reversal feels like threat. What once protected against shock now creates it. The temporary has become embedded. And embedded systems resist change. Stability depends on continuity. Even when continuity contradicts original intent, the path back to normal becomes unclear because normal has been redefined. The conflict is no longer about crisis management. It is about exit. And exiting a measure that never ended proves far more difficult than entering it ever was. Because when systems adapt to support, the greatest risk is not collapse, but dependence revealed by withdrawal. The reckoning arrives when the system finally confronts the cost of permanence. Temporary measures did not fail. They succeeded, so completely that the system reorganized itself around their existence. Stability was preserved, but independence was quietly surrendered. In response, policymakers begin redefining success. The goal shifts from sustaining calm to restoring self-sufficiency. Exit strategies are framed not as withdrawals, but as tests of resilience. Support remains available, but it is deliberately harder to reach. Silence becomes intentional, not neglectful. Institutions adapt unevenly. Some struggle to operate without constant accommodation. Others rediscover flexibility they had set aside. Risk management becomes more conservative. Liquidity planning regains depth. The system learns again how to function without immediate reassurance. Markets adjust slowly. Volatility returns where it was suppressed. Price discovery reemerges. Confidence becomes less smooth, but more durable. Stability no longer depends on continuation. It depends on adaptation. Comfort gives way to credibility. For the public, trust rebuilds cautiously, not because uncertainty disappears, but because boundaries become clearer. Support exists, but it is no longer assumed. The system feels less protected, but more real. Looking back, the permanence of temporary measures reveals a critical lesson. Relief tools are most effective when they are clearly temporary. When they linger, they reshape behavior in ways that make exit difficult and dependence invisible. True resilience requires the ability to stand without constant support, to accept volatility without immediate rescue, and to understand that stability earned through adaptation lasts longer than stability maintained through continuation. Because a system that cannot function without its emergencies is not stable at all. Subscribe to join the journey. How